The Promise at Thornwick Harbor. It was a bright morning in June 1898, and Eleanor Sinclair stood in her mother's altered lace wedding gown, studying her own reflection one final time before she was meant to leave for the chapel. She could not have said, looking back on it, what she felt most in that moment: nerves or resignation, or something quieter than either. What she did not know, though nothing in the world could have convinced her of it just then, was that within the hour, everything she believed about the past 2 years of her life was about to come entirely undone. To understand how she came to be standing in that gown at all, we have to go back 2 years, to the summer her family first arrived in Thornwick Harbor, and to a fisherman's son who saw her exactly once at a crowded dock and never quite recovered from it. Elenor Sinclair's family arrived in Thornwick Harbor in the summer of 1896 in a train of wagons loaded with furniture too fine for the modest coastal town they were moving to. Her father, Edmund Sinclair, had made his fortune in shipping trade routes along the eastern seaboard, and he had bought, sight unseen, one of the largest estates on the ridge above the harbor, a handsome white house with a view of the water that he liked to say had cost him a small fortune and was worth every cent of it. Elenor was 17 that summer, and she thought Thornwick Harbor a very small place after the city she'd grown up in. Right up until the afternoon, her father took her and her mother down to the docks to see the port he intended to do business through. She saw William Ashford before he saw her, a broad-shouldered young man hauling nets alongside two older fishermen, sleeves rolled to the elbow, laughing at something one of them had said. And then, as if he'd felt the weight of being watched, he looked up, and their eyes met across the length of the dock, and Elenor would swear for the rest of her life that something in her chest simply settled, the way a compass needle settles once it's found north. He did not approach her that day. He was not fool enough to walk up to a shipping merchant's daughter in his work clothes with fish scales on his hands. But he watched her the whole length of the dock, and she knew he watched her, and neither of them said a single word about it to anyone. It took William the better part of 3 months to work up the nerve to do anything about it. He learned, the way one learns everything in a town the size of Thornwick Harbor, that Miss Sinclair visited Mrs. Averley's dress shop on Market Street every Thursday afternoon, without fail, to look over new patterns and fabric. He learned this from his younger sister, who worked as a shop girl 2 doors down, and found the whole business of William Ashford mooning over a merchant's daughter enormously entertaining. He did not have the courage that first Thursday or the second. On the third, he paid the paper boy 2 cents to hand Elenor a folded note the moment she stepped out of Mrs. Averley's shop, and then he stood across the street, pretending with all his might to be interested in a barrel of rope, watching her unfold it. The note said, in William's careful, unpracticed hand, "I don't know how to say this properly, so I'll simply say it plainly. I saw you at the docks in June, and I haven't been right since. If you'd allow me to walk you home on a Thursday sometime, I'd be obliged. William Ashford, of the harbor." Elenor read it twice, looked up, found him instantly across the street, badly hidden behind his barrel of rope, and laughed, bright and unguarded, in a way that undid him completely. "You could simply have said hello, Mr. Ashford," she called across the street. "I'm told I've a talent for making the simple things difficult," he called back, and crossed to meet her. He walked her home that Thursday, and the Thursday after, and within a season, the whole town understood that William Ashford and Eleanor Sinclair were courting, whatever her father's initial reservations about the match. The Ashfords were not a wealthy family, William's father and grandfather before him had fished these waters their whole lives, and the family had never known anything close to comfort. But they were known up and down Thornwick Harbor as people of uncommon decency, honest in trade, faithful in church, the kind of family other families spoke well of without being asked to. Edmund Sinclair, for all his trade route fortune, found he could not object to that, however much he might have preferred a match with more money behind it. By the following spring, William had begun quietly to put money aside for a proper ring. For a season, life in Thornwick Harbor moved exactly as it should. There were Sunday dinners at the Sinclair house, where Edmund Sinclair had come, slowly, to think well of the young man his daughter had chosen. There were evening walks along the water, and quiet talk of a small house near the harbor, and the particular, unremarkable happiness of two people who believed, as young people generally do, that they had all the time in the world still ahead of them. They did not. That winter, the newspapers Edmund Sinclair read over breakfast had begun carrying more and more news of trouble brewing with Spain. A ship lost off Havana, harsh words exchanged between governments, the particular kind of headline that grows a little larger every week until one day it is no longer background noise at all. Most of Thornwick Harbor paid it little mind through the winter months. By spring, no one in town could ignore it any longer. The war reached Thornwick Harbor, the way it reached every small town in America that spring, first as rumor, then as headline, and finally as a recruiting officer setting up a folding table outside the post office with a line of young men forming in front of it before the ink on the newspapers was even dry. William signed his name on a Tuesday. He left the following morning. There had been no time for the proper things. No formal request to Edmund Sinclair for his daughter's hand, no ring on Eleanor's finger, none of the small ceremonies a longer engagement might have allowed. There had only been one evening to say what needed saying, and one morning at the harbor to say goodbye. Elenor came down to the docks before dawn, her cloak pulled tight against the cold, and found William already there among a dozen other young men from town, all of them trying, with varying success, to look braver than they felt. "I should have asked your father months ago," William told her, low, for her ears only, as the other families said their own goodbyes around them. "I kept waiting for the money to be right, for the timing to be right, and now there's no time left at all." "Then ask him when you come home," Elenor said. "I'm not going anywhere." He took a small ring from his coat pocket, plain gold, modest, exactly what a fisherman's savings could afford. And instead of placing it on her finger, he threaded it onto a fine chain and fastened it around her neck, tucking it beneath the collar of her dress where it would rest, hidden against her heart. "Wear it here for now," he said. "When I come home, I'll do this properly. I'll ask your father first, the way it ought to be done, and then I'll put it where it belongs. But I wanted you to have it before I left. I wanted you to know I meant it, whatever comes." "Nothing is going to come, William Ashford. I've decided it. You don't get a say." He laughed, the sound catching a little in his throat, and kissed her once, briefly, properly, in front of the whole assembled crowd of Thornwick Harbor, which caused a small scandal among the older women present, and which neither of them regretted for a single moment. Then the whistle sounded, and the young men filed onto the transport, and Elenor stood on the dock with her hand pressed to the ring beneath her collar until the ship was nothing but a smudge of smoke on the horizon. The letter came in midsummer. It was not, in the end, a telegram delivered by a breathless boy, but a formal notice from the War Department, forwarded through the regiment's home post, a printed list of names under a heading that made Eleanor's hands go cold before she'd even found Williams among them. Missing following engagement near Santiago. Status unconfirmed. Missing was not the same as dead, and Elenor told herself this every day for 6 months, the way a person tells themselves anything they need badly enough to believe. She wore the ring beneath her collar without fail. She wrote letters that had nowhere confirmed to go, and sent them anyway, on the chance that somewhere, in some hospital or camp she couldn't picture, William might still be alive to receive them. But 6 months is a long time for a small town to hold its breath, and by the turn of the year, Thornwick Harbor had begun, gently and without unkindness, to speak of William Ashford in the past tense. His mother wore black. His father stopped going down to the harbor most mornings, unable to bear the water without his son beside it. And Elenor, though she never once took the ring from around her neck, found that even her own hope had begun, against her will, to grow thin and worn at the edges, like a coat mended too many times. It was during that long, grieving winter that Charles Whitfield began, quietly and without any great declaration, to make himself present in Eleanor's life. Charles was William's cousin on his mother's side, and heir to the Whitfield shipping fortune, one of the wealthiest families in the county, and a family that had in fact done a great deal of business with Eleanor's own father over the years. He had known Elenor since her family's first summer in Thornwick Harbor, and he had loved her, quietly and from a careful distance, for very nearly as long, never once saying so while his cousin was courting her, because Charles Whitfield had always believed himself a decent man, and a decent man did not pursue his cousin's intended. But William was gone, or believed gone, and grief has a way of drawing people together who might otherwise have kept their distance. Charles began calling at the Sinclair house that winter, first with condolences, then with small kindnesses, then simply because Elenor had come to find his presence a comfort in a house grown heavy with mourning. There was, that winter, another grief in the Sinclair household besides William. The war had disrupted the shipping trade routes Edmund Sinclair's fortune depended on, and disrupted them badly. Cargo delayed, contracts broken, insurance claims that took months to resolve, if they resolved at all. By spring, it had become clear that the Sinclair family's comfortable fortune was in genuine danger, and Edmund himself had begun to look older than his years, worn thin by ledgers that refused to balance. Charles never once mentioned the money directly. He didn't need to. His steadiness, his obvious means, the ease with which he might one day secure a family's future, all of it sat quietly in the room every time he called, unspoken and impossible to ignore. Elenor found herself, that spring, leaning on Charles in a way she had not expected to. He was kind, he was patient. He never once pressed her, never once suggested it was time to move past a grief she still carried every day beneath her collar. And yet, even as she came to care for him, genuinely, if quietly, she noticed that some small, essential part of her remained closed off, untouched, still waiting on a promise made at a harbor a year before. She never told him about the ring. Charles asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, in the garden behind her family's house, with a formality that suited him. No sudden declarations, no dramatic flourish, simply an honest offer plainly made. "I know I'm not the man you once pictured yourself marrying," he told her. "I make no claim to be, but I would spend the whole of my life trying to make you glad you said yes, if you'll let me." Elenor said yes. She said yes because she had come, in her own quiet way, to care for him. She said yes because her father's fortune was crumbling, and Charles's was not, and she was not so foolish as to pretend that mattered nothing at all. And she said yes, if she was honest with herself, in the small hours of the night, because a full year had passed with no further word of William, and a person cannot mourn a ghost forever and still call it living. The wedding was set for June. Elenor allowed herself, in the weeks that followed, to be swept along by the preparations, the flowers, the guest list, her mother's altered lace, and told herself, as she had told herself a great many things that year, that this was simply what sensible women did when hope had run its course. She kept the ring beneath her collar the entire time. She could not have said, if asked, exactly why. Which brings us back to that bright June morning, and Elenor standing before her mirror in her mother's altered lace, studying a reflection she barely recognized as her own. She did not feel in that final hour the pure and simple joy a bride is meant to feel. She felt instead a strange, muted calm, the calm of a decision long since made, arrived at through a year of grief and practicality rather than through love's usual sudden certainty. She told herself this was simply what it felt like to be sensible. She told herself a great many things that morning, standing in front of the glass. Her mother called up the stairs that the carriage had arrived. Elenor took one last look at herself, touched the place at her collar where the ring still rested, hidden as it had been for 2 years, and went down to meet the morning she had for so long believed was the only one left available to her. She crossed the front hall. She reached for the great oak doors her father had been so proud of when they'd first moved to Thornwick Harbor. She pulled them open, expecting to see the carriage and the driver. But instead, she couldn't believe what she saw. William Ashford stood on the front steps of the Sinclair house in a soldier's uniform gone thin and grey with wear, thinner himself than she remembered, leaning slightly on a cane he had not needed 2 years before. His face was harder than she remembered too, weathered by a year and a half she knew nothing of, but his eyes, when they found hers, were exactly as kind as they had always been. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The morning went very quiet around them, as if the whole of Thornwick Harbor had paused to watch. "You're alive," Elenor finally managed, and her voice broke clean in two on the second word. "So it seems," William said, and something in his careful composure cracked as well. "I know what today is, Elenor. I know I have no right to be standing on these steps. I only found out 3 days ago that you were to be married, and I have not stopped moving since." He held a folded paper in his hand, official, stamped in heavy ink at the bottom, and he pressed it toward her now with a kind of urgency that suggested he had rehearsed none of this and meant to say all of it anyway, whether the words came out in order or not. "I have to tell you what happened," he said, "because I think you deserve to understand, whatever you decide to do next." And there, on the front steps, in his tattered uniform, with the carriage waiting uselessly at the curb, William told her, quickly, roughly, the way a man tells a story he has not yet found peace with, of the battle near Santiago, of an ambush that had scattered his company into the brush, of a young soldier named Jonathan Everly, barely 19, shot through the leg and unable to walk, whom William had refused to leave behind, though every instinct of self-preservation told him to run. He told her of carrying Jonathan Everly through a mile of hostile ground on a leg that would never fully heal from what that mile cost it. He told her of the field hospital that saved them both, of a year lost to fever and recovery and a paperwork tangle that had swallowed his name whole, of finally being accounted for and sent home, only to arrive and find the whole town had long since buried him in their hearts. Jonathan Everly's family, William said, holding up the stamped paper, are not modest people, Elenor. His father owns half the railroad line running out of Boston. They wrote to me. They'd been trying to find me for months, ever since Jonathan told them what happened on that hillside. This is a letter of credit. It's more money than I have ever seen in my life. Enough for us to live comfortably wherever we chose. Enough, I think, to see your father's estate through whatever trouble the war has left it in, if you'd allow me to offer it. Elenor stared at the paper, and then at William, and understood, all at once, that the practical reasoning that had carried her through the last year of her life, the reasoning that had made marrying Charles feel not just acceptable, but sensible, had just quietly ceased to apply. "I'm not asking you to choose me because of the money," William said quickly, watching her face. "I'm asking you to choose me because I never stopped loving you, not for a single day, wherever I was. The money simply means that if you do, no one has to suffer for it. Least of all, your father." Elenor reached up without a word and drew the ring out from beneath her collar, where it had rested, hidden, for 2 full years. "I never took it off," she said. "Not once. Not even when I said yes to Charles. I told myself it didn't mean anything, keeping it. I think I always knew it meant everything." She found Charles at the chapel an hour later, still in his wedding coat, and told him everything. William's return, the money, the ring she had never once removed. She did not soften it, because she thought he deserved better than a soft version of the truth. Charles was quiet for a long moment, and something moved across his face that was grief and relief, and something that looked almost like recognition, all at once. "I think some part of me has known this was coming since the moment you told me he was alive," he said finally. "I told myself a great many things this past year, Elenor, and very few of them, I think, were entirely honest." He managed with visible effort something close to a smile. "I loved you as well as I knew how. I don't regret a moment of it. But I don't think I ever once believed I loved you the way he does. The kind of love that survives a war and finds its way back to a doorstep with nothing but a folded paper and a year's worth of nerve." "I'm so sorry, Charles." "Don't be." He took her hand, briefly, and let it go. "Go and be happy, Elenor. It's what I wanted for you all along, even when I hoped, selfishly, that the happiness in question might have my name attached to it." He walked her himself to where William was waiting at the back of the chapel and shook his cousin's hand, and there was nothing false in the gesture at all, only the particular, bittersweet grace of a man who has lost something and found in losing it that he can still be glad for the person who won it instead. They were married that autumn, quietly, in the same chapel, with Charles himself among the guests, a small, generous gesture that surprised no one who had come to know him that year. Jonathan Everly's family's gift saw Edmund Sinclair's estate through its difficulties and left William and Elenor comfortable. Besides, though they chose, in the end, to live simply, a modest house near the harbor, within sight of the water William had grown up beside, close enough that he could still walk down most mornings, leaning on his cane, and watch the boats go out. Elenor never took the ring off again. She wore it, at last, exactly where it belonged.